Hello, my name's Houston, and this is Media Mood Board. Yes, my name's Houston, and this is Media Mood Board, a weekly show about hyper-specific entertainment lists. Well, today, the International Booker Prize released its Longlist. Whenever I can, I like to read from these, nominees for awards lists. But which one to choose? So I'm just going to go through them, and we'll decide together. So in case you don't know about the International Booker Prize, it's an annual award, much like the Booker, except for instead of it being in English language, it is something that was translated and then published in English in the last calendar year. It has a cash prize, which is split 50-50 between the translator and the author. Like the Booker, it's judged by a panel of artists from a bunch of different disciplines. I think this year there's journalists and poets and visual artists, things like that. Just this week, the long list was announced, which narrows it down to 13. That will then be further narrowed down to 6, which is called the short list, and we'll see that next month. And then the ultimate winner from the short list is going to be announced in May. There are 10 different languages represented here. I'll translate it into English. Out of the 13 authors, one has won this prize before, and 9 of them, this is their first time to even be on the long list, period. Hey, hey. The judges sometimes give a loose theme for after they've selected everything, what the through line is between all the books, and I'll read their quote from that. To emphasize our common humanity in a violent world. Quote, books that speak of courage and kindness, of the vital importance of community, and of the effects of standing up to tyranny. What I'd like to offer here is a truncated audio version of what they offer on the Booker website. There's a lot of details that they have about all these books and why they're selected and everything, and I will have the link to the Booker website, the specific section you can look to see all the details in the description. For each entry, I'll say the book's name. I'll show the cover on the screen. I love covers. Then I'll give a brief description of a book. Normally, this is just a blurb from the publisher. In some cases, I've combined what the judges have said about the book and the publisher's blurb, just trying to create something that's the most coherent and compelling as far as what this book is trying to do and why you might want to read it. And then after that, on the Booker page for each book, they've listed a series of discussion questions for after you've read the book. And so what I've done is gone in there and picked one or combined some together in a way that is not plot spoilery, but speaks to the form of the book or further why you might want to be interested in reading this. See if it tickles something that you're interested in. I'll show the translator and the author's bios on screen. So if you end up the premise of a book sounds interesting, you want to learn more about the writers, feel free to pause on those. All right, let's get to the list. I apologize in advance for my pronunciation on everything, probably. Number 1, Simpatía. The book is set in contemporary Venezuela, amid a mass exodus of the intellectual class who have been leaving their pets behind. Ulysses Khan, the protagonist and a movie buff, receives a text message from his wife, Paulina, saying she is leaving the country and him. Ulysses is not heartbroken, but liberated by Paulina's departure. Ulysses discovers that he's been entrusted with a mission: to transform the great family home into a shelter for abandoned dogs. And if he manages to do it in time, he'll inherit the luxurious apartment that he had shared with Paulina. Ulysses has grown up orphaned, and while he was adopted at the age of 8, he didn't feel like his adopted parents were his family. Do you think the dog shelter has given him a chance to find his new chosen family of sorts? What facets of the work he's doing do you think helped him to find that missing piece of his life? Number 2, Not a River. Enero and El Negro have brought their young friend and protege, Tillo, on a fishing trip along the Parana River in Argentina. The island where they set up camp pulses with its own desires and angers. Alongside the stories of these grief-marred characters, the author offers those of the women of the town. The mother whose ever-growing fire engulfs her, her 2 flirtatious, youth-glowed daughters, and the almost mythical manta ray, who becomes one of the guardians and ghosts of this throbbing, feverish novel. Annie McDermott said in her translator's note that the line breaks and lack of character divisions make the text itself river-shaped. Do you think that the way the story is structured represents a flowing river? What are some examples that show this? Number 3, Kairos, Berlin, July 11th, 1986. They meet by chance on a bus. She is a young student, and he is older and married. Theirs is an intense and sudden attraction, fueled by a shared passion for music and art, and heightened by the secrecy they must maintain. But when she strays for a single night, he cannot forgive her, and a dangerous crack forms between them, opening up a space for cruelty, punishment, in the exertion of power. An intimate and devastating story of the path of two lovers through the ruins of a relationship set against the backdrop of a seismic period in European history. Erpenbeck shifts perspective throughout the novel, oscillating between that of Katarina and Hans. She does this frequently, sometimes within the same sentence, and with no signaling to the reader that this shift has occurred. What effect does this technique of duality have on the text? Number 4. The details. In the throes of a high fever, a woman lies bedridden. Suddenly, she is struck with an urge to revisit a particular novel from her past. Inside the book is an inscription, a message from an ex-girlfriend. Pages from her past begin to flip, full of things she cannot forget and people who cannot be forgotten. Who is the real subject of a portrait? The person being painted, or the one holding the brush? The Details lacks a conventional plot, with arguably no beginning, middle, or end. Many details emerge from a fever dream of the narrator's memory in a fragmentary and non-linear manner. With its lack of chronology, what role does time play in the novel? How did it give you a sense of perspective throughout, and particularly at the end of your reading? Number 5. White Nights. White Nights is a series of 13 interconnected stories concerning the various tragedies and misfortunes that befall a group of people who all grew up and live or lived in the same village in the Beskidznicki region of southern Poland. Each story centers itself around a different character and how it is that they manage to cope, survive, or merely exist, despite and often in ignorance of the poverty, disappointment, tragedy, despair, brutality, and general sense of futility that surrounds them. Considering this is poet Urszula Honek's debut story collection, how do you imagine her style of writing has changed as she's moved between the mediums of poetry and prose? What links to her background in poetry have you noticed when reading these short stories? Number 6. Mater 210. An epic multi-generational tale that threads together a century of Korean history, centered on 3 generations of a family of rail workers and a laid-off factory employee staging a high-altitude sit-in. Mater 210 vividly depicts the lives of ordinary working Koreans, starting from the Japanese colonial era, continuing through liberation, and right up to the 21st century. Much of Mater 210 is concerned with documenting the real lives of working-class Koreans across generations, particularly the period of 1910 to 1945, when Korea was colonized by Japan. Hwang Sok-yong writes this in a way that he terms as halfway between folklore and plain talk. Do you think the author is successful in educating the reader on the plight of ordinary Koreans through his unique blend of oral history spliced with elements of magical realism? Number 7. A Dictator Calls. In June 1934, Joseph Stalin reportedly telephoned the famous novelist and poet Boris Pasternak to discuss the arrest of Pasternak's fellow Soviet poet Osip Mandelstam. In a fascinating combination of dossier facts, dreams, and memories, Ismail Kadare, winner of the inaugural International Booker Prize, reconstructs the 3 minutes they spoke and the aftershocks of this tense, mysterious moment in modern history. The telling brings to light uncanny parallels with Kadare's experiences writing under dictatorship when he received an unexpected phone call of his own. 13 different accounts of the phone call are explored. Why do you think the author chose to record so many different accounts of the phone call when, as he writes himself, 2 would be enough to create confusion? Does having so many versions of the same events lead us closer to the truth, or does it take us farther from it? 8. The Silver Bone. A crime mystery set in 1919 Kiev during a time of chaos, shifts of power, and random violence in the aftermath of war. A young engineering student sees his father cut down by Cossacks, and, moments later, the saber cuts off his own right ear. He manages to catch it and keep it in a box, where it can still hear for him, wherever it is. Inspired by real-life, post-First World War Bolshevik secret police files. Kirchhoff is often described as a blackly comic and satirical writer. Discuss the ways in which Kirchhoff uses humor to make serious observations in The Silver Bone. Number 9. What I'd Rather Not Think About. What if one half of a pair of twins no longer wants to live? What if the other can't live without them? The narrator is a twin whose brother has recently taken its own life. She looks back on their childhood and tells of their adult lives, how her brother tried to find happiness but lost himself in various men and the Bhagwan movement, though never completely. What I'd Rather Not Think About is made up of a series of vignettes, small chapters, often no longer than a paragraph in length, that traverse back and forth through time as the narrator recounts her life with her twin brother. Why do you think Pothuma adopted this format for the book? And what does it offer the reader that a traditional, linear novel could not? Number 10, Lost on Me. Vero has grown up in Rome with her eccentric family, an omnipresent mother who's devoted to her own anxiety, a father ruled by hygienic and architectural obsessions, and a precocious genius brother at the center of all their attention. As she becomes an adult, Vero's needs to strike out on her own leads her into bizarre and comical situations. Numerous reviews have compared this book to the hit TV show Fleabag, with its witty, sarcastic writing and confessional nature. If you've watched the TV show, how might the two main characters' personalities intersect? Do they share any specific similar views of the world? Number 11, The House on Via Gemito. A railway clerk is convinced he possesses great artistic talent. If he didn't have a family to feed, he'd be a world-famous painter. Ambitious and frustrated, genuinely talented but full of arrogance and resentment, his life is marked by bitter disappointment. It's his firstborn who, years later, will sift the lies from the truth to tell the story of a man he's spent his whole life trying not to resemble. It's been rumored that acclaimed Booker Prize nominated Italian author Elena Ferrante, whose true identity has long been a mystery, is in fact either Domenico Starnon or his wife Anita Raha. An Italian literary critic claimed that there were significant similarities between Starnon's The House on Via Gemito and Ferrante's debut novel, Troubling Love, as well as other similarities throughout their respective works. If you've read books by both authors, what certain similarities have you found that could prove this theory as to be true? Number 12. Crooked Plow. Deep in Brazil's neglected Bahá'í hinterland, two sisters find an ancient knife between their grandmother's bed and, momentarily mystified by its power, decide to taste its metal. The shuddering violence that follows marks their lives and binds them together forever. Crooked Plow is a novel written in 3 parts, with the first 2 sections being narrated by each sister, whereas in the final section, an ancient spirit tells the story. This section begins in first person, but then switches to second person. What did these perspective switches offer you as a reader? And do you think the novel benefited from the adoption of these techniques? And the final nominee on the long list, Undiscovered. Alone in an ethnographic museum in Paris, Gabriella Wiener is confronted with her unusual inheritance. She is visiting an exhibition of pre-Columbian artifacts, many of them from her home country of Peru. Peering through the glass, she sees sculptures of indigenous faces that resemble her own. But the man responsible for pillaging them was her own great-great-grandfather, Austrian colonial explorer Charles Wiener. In the wake of her father's death, Gabriella begins delving into all she has inherited from her paternal line, from the brutal trail of racism and thefts Charles was responsible for, to revelations of her father's infidelity, and questions his impact on her own struggles with desire, love, and race in a polyamorous relationship. Gabriella has said she included a large amount of personal history and experiences in the book. In a New York Times article, it was mentioned that Gabriella's, quote, unconventional and kamikaze approach to writing has prompted critics at times to label her work as not literature, but testimony. To what extent do you agree? Okay, you made it. That's the list. That's all 13 of the long-listed International Booker Prize nominees. If there are any of those that sounded interesting to you, go to the Booker website. They have deep dives and reader's guides that go in more in depth in these things. They have some supplemental reading if any of that sounds interesting. As for me, my top 3 from this list, just based on the descriptions and kind of what they're about, are The Silver Bone, Not a River, and Dictator Calls. With The Silver Bone, I love that kind of like fantasy element of this kind of crime novel about someone whose literal ears in another place and they can spy and hear things while they're also like being sneaky and being physical with their own body. Not a River sounds really interesting from a formal perspective based on the kind of author bio. It sounds like Faulkner-y, like Flannery O'Connor-y. So these kind of like tight punctuated sentences sounds like a fun read. And there's a mythical manta ray. What is that? And with The Dictator Calls, it just seems like one of my favorite types of documentaries, which is being hyper specific on something small. So viewing one 3-minute phone call from 13 different ways. And then as far as I understand it, the second half of the book is like a long extended essay, like breaking apart all of that. That just seems so cool to me to present it all. And then it's almost like a mystery novel. Any of these sound interesting to you? Are there any of those that piqued your interest or that you're going to try to read? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw here, you can follow Media Mood Board on Letterboxd, on Goodreads, or just here. I'll be back next week with another hyper-specific entertainment list. My name is Houston. This is Media Mood Board. Bye.